Hello everybody, welcome to the start of chapter 3, which is going to be all about energy. The chapter itself is broken down into 3 concepts. We're going to take a look at the use of energy by cells. Part 2 is going to be about free energy and catalysis. And then last but not least, in our third part, we're going to take a look at different activated carriers and biosynthesis. So let's go ahead and let's dive into our first content topic, which is the use of energy by cells. Now, one of the main characteristics of a living entity is that it will always require energy. And energy can take on many different forms. So what chapter 3 will focus on is exactly where do we get this energy? How do we use this energy? And exactly what are the different types of energies that we have access to? And along the way, we also have to talk about the laws of thermodynamics, and we also definitely have to mention heat and how it plays a major role in the transfer of energy from one source to the next. Now, one thing that I definitely want to start the chapter off with is the term metabolism. Many of us have heard this term before, and for a lot of us, if you hear metabolism, we're thinking, oh, well, that's like our digestive system. That usually means that we're breaking down something. Like maybe we're breaking down our breakfast, our lunch, our dinner molecules into smaller pieces. And you're partially correct by assuming so. But it turns out that in the sense of a biology key term, metabolism is going to take a look at the total amount of energy that a cell pertains. And this energy can either be utilized or it can be released. Because it turns out that within metabolism, you're going to see 2 main pathways that are going to have to be addressed. So go ahead and take a look at the illustration that's on top of your slide. And what you're going to see is that they went ahead and they graphed out for you what they like to call a catabolic pathway and an anabolic pathway. Now, a catabolic pathway is going to be concerned with breaking down molecules and releasing their chemical bonds, because within those chemical bonds, there's going to be lots of energy that we can release into the system and utilize for other concepts. A really good example of a catabolic pathway is your digestive system. So on your illustration, they went ahead and they gave you an example of when our body becomes exposed to food molecules. So let's say we sat down and we ate a chicken sandwich. The bread is full of carbs. The piece of chicken is full of protein. These are all macromolecules. These are all polymers, large entities. And they're so large because they're filled with chemical bonds with their electrons interacting with each other and creating things like covalent bonds, hydrogen bonds, ionic bonds. Within these bonds, these electrons carry a lot of energy. So what our body needs to do is it needs to take these macromolecules and through the process of hydrolysis in our digestive system, it needs to pull them apart so that they go from polymer to monomer, that they go from a large complex to their subunits. So I'm breaking down my carbs into simple sugar, like glucose. I'm breaking down my proteins into my amino acids. And as I'm breaking it apart, there's going to be 2 things that are going to happen. The first thing is that I'm going to start releasing the energy that are being housed within those chemical bonds. The second thing is that the transfer of me breaking the bonds and releasing the energy from a polymer to a monomer is not going to be 100% releasing energy that can be used. Some of it is also going to be lost in heat, in the form of heat. And heat is a very highly disorganized form of energy. Our body will not be able to use a lot of the energy housed within the heat. Instead, it will focus on the useful form of energy that's being released. Now, I'm hoping as I'm saying useful form, some of you are going, what's a useful form of energy? What does that mean? Well, a useful form of energy means that we can, for instance, present it to the mitochondria, and the mitochondria can convert that energy into ATP molecules. Why ATP molecules? Well, because that's our chemical form of energy. That's the energy that our cells rely on to get work done. The same thing that's represented in this diagram, it shows you that once you release energy from a catabolic pathway, notice how you're not done yet, right? Because what we see happening is out of our box there, it says useful form of energy. We see that there's another arrow that's coming out of it, and it's leading us to our second pathway, our anabolic pathway. Anabolic pathways are concerned with building. So this is where we take a monomer and we build it into a polymer. So we take our amino acids and we build it back into proteins that, for instance, we can use for muscle composition. We take our sugars and we build them into hormones. We build them into different secretions. We take our amino acids and we build them into things like our chemical signals. We take them in protein carriers. Our cells rely on a lot of molecules to maintain homeostasis. So we need to continuously build these larger entities. When we're building, we're doing it in an anabolic pathway. So anabolic means that I am going from small to large, from monomer to polymer. I am building. And in order for me to do this, it's going to require energy. As you can see, both of these pathways will play off each other because a catabolic pathway, as it's releasing the molecules, as it's allowing them to go from large to small and breaking them down, it's releasing energy into your system. So you get more energy that you can utilize. And if you want to complete an anabolic pathway and you want to build, you want to go from small to large, this is going to require effort on the body's end. So that means that you're going to require the energy into the system. So as you can see, one provides the energy for the other one to use. Collectively, this entire flow of energy is then umbrellaed under the term metabolism. There are certain laws of thermodynamics, meaning that there are certain ways that energy will work. And we're really more concerned with the first and the second law of thermodynamics in this chapter. And we're actually going to go a little bit out of order. We're going to start with the second law. The second law of thermodynamics says that when I'm transferring energy from one source to the next, I'm not able to 100% transfer that energy completely. And the reason this happens is because along the way of me transferring that energy, I'm going to lose a lot of it in the form of heat. And as I mentioned to you before, heat is a very disorganized form of energy. So the second law of thermodynamics says the more I move my energy around, the greater the chances are that I release heat. And since heat is very disorganized, it's going to lead to what I call entropy. Entropy is a measurement of disorder. So let's, for instance, take a look at the picture that the book has provided for us. So you can see we have a young child who's sitting behind their desk. Hi, there you go. We have a young child who's sitting behind their desk, and maybe they're drawing or whatnot. Well, what we see happening is that over time, it's quite normal for that child to start roaming around and maybe look for another activity. So maybe they want to read a book, maybe they want to look for a toy, maybe they want to go ahead and look for more coloring material. I don't know. Either way, what we do, is same thing as the child, is that we start roaming around throughout our day and we start looking for different entities to do tasks. Now, it's very easy for our space to become disorganized because we'll go ahead and we'll grab our items and we might not want to necessarily put it back. So over time, what we see happening in our illustration is that as time lapses, we start getting this spontaneous reaction that's going to lead us to become more disorganized. So as you can see, the room becomes very disorganized over time. Now, this is exactly what happens when you start transferring energy. So what do I mean with that? Well, it took energy for the child to get up from the chair. It took energy from the child to pull out a bin to look for a new toy, to go through his bookcase and see if there's a book that he wants to read, to search for his favorite toy. And as we're searching and we're going about, everything around us starts to kind of scatter. We make a little bit of a mess. And as that occurs, we're basically demonstrating the increase of disorganization in our environment, which is going to be our entropy. Now, can we reverse that? Well, yeah, of course. You can go in and you can clean the room, correct? But keep in mind that if you want to go from unorganized state back to organized, it is not only going to require you to intentionally say, hey, I need to clean up, so it's an intentional act. You need to plan for it and you need to exert it, but you're also going to have to require an input of energy. So it is the complete opposite of the spontaneous reaction that caused the entropy to occur. If you don't like my example of a child sitting behind his desk and the room going from organized to unorganized, let me give you another example. Let's say you are changing a light bulb, okay? And in the process of changing the light bulb, an accident happens where you drop the light bulb and it falls, bam, hits the floor and it shatters in 100 pieces. Technically, those 100 pieces still collectively make up a light bulb, but we can't utilize it as we could the light bulb when it was as a whole. Now, the whole process of the light bulb shattering, that is entropy. The light bulb becomes unorganized. It becomes shattered in so many pieces that we can't utilize it as a whole anymore. Is it still a light bulb? Technically, yes. And if you have lots of free time, we can gather the little pieces together and glue them together so that we can get the original form of the light bulb. But it will never be the same. So this is what the law of thermodynamics is trying to tell us with its second law. It says that energy is transferred, but it doesn't stay the same from our first to our second place because we lose little pieces of energy in the form of heat. And heat is going to be a massively disordered form of energy, which means that it leads us to entropy. So anytime you see the term entropy, and I kind of wrote it down in your PowerPoint right there, I want you to think disorder, chaos. And the reason you get entropy is because you release heat as you move energy from one source to the next. And we can even take this concept of heat dispersal and disorganization and entropy, and we can even apply it to us on a cellular level, because cells, even when you look at them under the microscope, they look nice and organized, they're very calm, but it turns out that from a chemical aspect, they're also generating lots of heat. So let me give you an example. So on your left hand side right there, you can see that they drew a cell for you. Here's my little cell with its cell membrane. It has a little cytoplasm in the light gray. Here's my little nucleus. And in green are just the molecules that you would come across in the cytoplasm. The environment around here in blue, that's going to be my extracellular environment, mostly made out of water. And as you can see, there's also some molecules floating around. And the red arrows are going to indicate the direction that the molecules are moving around. Now, I should let you know that all molecules have what we call kinetic energy, which is energy of motion. So they're always kind of slightly vibrating in place. They're never really still. Now, what does that have to do with our thermodynamic laws, right? Well, it turns out that since our cell is the fundamental unit of life, anytime it does a chemical reaction, like maybe it gets access to some food molecules and it has to do hydrolysis, or it has to build something, so it has to do a dehydration process, what we see happening is that along the way, as it's either releasing the energy or it's using the energy, we see that heat will be released. Remember our second law of thermodynamics, where as you transfer the energy, some of it is released in the form of heat. Now, because heat is so highly disorganized, it will quickly disperse from its origin point. So that's why on our illustration right here, we have the heat being represented in yellow arrows. And notice how it's quickly dispersing outside the cell. And it starts to interact with the molecules that were floating around in our extracellular environment. Do you notice anything strange about the molecules in the second picture? I hope that you're pointing out the fact that they're no longer perfect circles, but more importantly also that their red arrows have changed direction and have become a lot more random. And what we see happening is that you get an increase in disorder for the extracellular components, so you get an increase in entropy because of the interaction of the heat molecules. As the heat molecules quickly disperse from the cell into the extracellular fluid, they bump into the molecules that they come across, allowing these molecules to start cascading and vibrating at a much more exaggerated path. And that is then what's represented by the zigzagging of the red arrows. And this can be explained by saying, hey, it's becoming more disorganized, it is increasing in disorder, or you can just say to me, this is entropy. And this is all explained once again within the second law of thermodynamics, that when I transfer energy from one form to the next, I release heat in the process, and heat is very disorganized, allowing us to have an increase in disorder, aka entropy. Another thing that I definitely want to mention is that I keep telling you about transferring energy from one form to the next. So let's take a look at some of the forms of energy that we have access to. And probably the most common ones that are always discussed are going to be, and I'm going to use the illustration to represent this. So go ahead and take a look on your right-hand side. They are going to be kinetic energy and potential energy. Here we go. Here's our potential energy. Okay, so kinetic energy, KE, is energy of motion. Anything that you're doing right now, like for instance, let's say you're holding a pen, you're going to write down your notes, the fact that I'm talking, maybe some of us are enjoying a delicious snack while you're listening to me. Oh, a snack would be so good right now. All right, sorry, I'm getting off track. But anything that requires motion for you to do a task requires kinetic energy. So that's energy that you're currently using to get your work done. So as you're driving the car, that's kinetic energy. As you're walking, kinetic energy. Pedaling a bike, kinetic energy. So in this little example, we see right here that as a brick is falling, it's actually doing a motion of going downwards. That would be an example of kinetic energy. Then you have potential energy. Potential energy, as the name indicates, is energy that is being kept for later use. It is stored energy. So for instance, food. If you have a nice plate of food that you're looking at, that food is filled with potential energy, because you are eventually going to be chewing down on the food, and you're going to potentially take the energy from the food and transfer it into your body for later use. If you currently have gas in your car and your car is sitting in your driveway, it's just waiting for you, it has nothing to do, that car is filled with potential energy. So there are lots of different ways that we can obviously describe energy, but one of the common ways is to take a look at, am I currently using that energy? Am I doing a motion with the energy? Then that's called kinetic energy. If I am storing that energy for later use, then I'm taking a look at potential energy. So for instance, on my little illustration, you can see that you have a brick that's being raised. And this brick can potentially fall down, and that is because we can harvest the energy from gravity to do that for us. And as the brick actually starts moving, we see that that potential energy is converted to kinetic energy because it's actually falling. And as it gets to its final resting place here on the floor, we see that one thing that also happens is that it releases heat. Now, the release of heat was described in our second law of thermodynamics, right? None of the energy transfer is completely effective. We lose some of it in the form of heat. The first law of thermodynamics is actually addressed in this illustration, which is that energy can only be transferred from one form to the next. It is not lost, it is not created, and the total amount of energy in a system is completely constant. What does that mean? Well, it means that there are lots of different forms of energy, but none of these energies are created or destroyed. They're simply transferred or transformed from one source to the next. So for instance, when I sit down and I have my meal, what I'm doing is I'm taking the chemical bonds and I'm converting it into either potential energy or kinetic energy for my body, depending on if I'm storing that energy or I'm utilizing it right away. When I take a look at things like chemical bonds, so remember in chapter 2 we talked about things like covalent bonds, ionic bonds, the interaction of electrons from one molecule to the other. When you're creating these bonds are full of energy. And as we go ahead and do things like hydrolysis, use water molecules to pull it apart, then what we're doing is we're releasing the energy into the system, and we're also generating lots of heat. If you take a look, for instance, right here in my other diagram, where I have my chemical bond energy courtesy of my battery, I can hook that up to an appliance, and the appliance will start working. So in this case, my fan, the blades will start rotating, and it starts cooling down the area that it's providing the wind to. As it's doing that, then we see that the movement of the fan is an example of electrical energy. And the electrical energy obviously will cause the blades to move. So as the blade is moving, the actual movement of the blades is our kinetic energy. So there are lots of different ways to organize energy, but keep in mind that you're not creating. So you're not creating electrical energy. You're not creating kinetic energy. You're not destroying chemical bond energy. What you're doing is you're just taking the conversion of the energy that was being housed in the chemical bonds, and you're transferring it into an electrical setting, into a kinetic setting, into a potential setting. And oftentimes when we learn about energy, maybe you came across it in your other classes, you learn about it in the form of food webs. Food webs are an excellent way to demonstrate the first law of thermodynamics, which is that you neither create or destroy energy, you simply transfer it from one system to the next. So go ahead, and either what we can do is we can take a look at the little insert picture that I've applied. So here's my little insert picture. And if you've ever done a food web, you're basically demonstrating how food is provided from one organism to the next. And you usually start off with a small one, and then you kind of build it up to a larger one, right? So I just got this one off Google, and you could see, as with most food webs, we tend to start with the sun. Why? Well, because the sun is literally a ball of energy, and the sunlight, as it's radiating, this electromagnetic energy is used by producers or autotrophs to generate their own food products. So for instance, plants are a perfect category of being a producer because they can use their chloroplast molecule to do photosynthesis, and they're able to generate their own food. When they're doing this, they're transferring the energy from the sun into the energy needed to produce their glucose molecules, which is the end product of photosynthesis. Now, the plant itself will then go ahead and get consumed by a smaller organism. These organisms will tend to be what we like to call consumers. A consumer is also called a heterotroph, and that's because they're not able to generate their own food. Instead, they're going to have to consume other organisms and take their energy and transfer it from their system into their own. So for instance, my little grasshopper is going to come on, and it's going to eat the grass. And as it's eating the grass, it's basically taking the potential energy of the grass blades, and it's going to do hydrolysis so that it can convert the energy from the grass into its own body, and that potential energy can later be converted into kinetic energy, so it can hop away and it can do its daily task. That grasshopper can eventually be consumed by a second consumer, a larger organism, and as it's being consumed, once again, the energy is being transferred from one form to the next. And this food web will keep going. And as we continue to grow it, notice how the energy just keeps moving from one organism or one specimen to the next. Now, that's what our first law says, right? We don't create or destroy energy. We simply transfer it from one form to the next. And then our second law of thermodynamics says that when we're transferring it, it's not 100% effective because each transfer will generate the release of heat. So if I'm going to be completely correct, I need to go back in and make a little arrow also that says that as the energy is being transferred, it's releasing heat into the system. And that heat, ladies and gents, that is our entropy. Now, it turns out that this whole transfer of energy is constant because we're not creating or destroying, because eventually all these consumers and producers are going to die off. Unfortunately, that's the cycle of life, right? And when they die off, what we see happening is that we have other consumers, like for instance, fungi, that can come in and they'll go ahead and they'll start working on the carcasses or bodies of these dead organisms, and they'll break it down and release the energy back into the soil, back into the system. And then what we could see is that it can then continue to be utilized, for instance, by other producers to help in the assistance of photosynthesis. This is what a decomposer does. So a decomposer, like fungi, solely feeds off dead organisms or waste products so that we can recycle that energy back into the soil. And then a producer, like our little plant, can use the nutrients in the soil to assist in the process of photosynthesis, thereby once again recycling the energy and utilizing it in another form. So just to make sure, when it comes to the laws of thermodynamics, the first law says that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It's simply transferred from one form to the next, and that the total amount of energy is constant. The second law of thermodynamics says that the transfer of energy is very inefficient because you never transfer 100% from point A to point B. You'll lose some of it in the form of heat. And heat is very unorganized, meaning that we're going to label it as entropy. Now, one of the main ways that energy is discussed is through the discussion of the relationship between the sun and photosynthetic organisms, because the sun is a massive ball of energy that continues to radiate on Earth, and that energy is best captured by the use of photosynthesis, which of course we as humans can't do, but we can study plants and other photosynthetic organisms to see how they're able to capture that light energy and are able to convert it into food for themselves, making them the ultimate autotrope or a producer. Autotrope, auto means self. So an autotrope is a self-producer. It's able to generate all its own food. We are classified as heterotrophs because I mentioned to you before in the food web featured that we have to consume other organisms to get their energy. We can't simply stand outside in the sun and make all our own carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Unfortunately, we're going to have to consume either animal or plant-based products to get access to that. Now, I don't want to talk too much about photosynthesis in this chapter because in a little bit we're going to discuss chapter 14, whose main topic is all the different steps of photosynthesis. But I do want to point out some entities right here because it's going to make it a little bit easier to understand some of the concepts you're going to come across in chapter 3. In photosynthesis itself, it turns out that you have two main steps that need to be completed. You have stage 1, which is all about capturing light energy, and this is what we like to call the light-dependent stage. In the light-dependent stage, what we see happening is that inside the chloroplast organelle, the energy from the sun, the electromagnetic energy of the sun, is exposed to the chloroplast, and the chloroplast will utilize water molecules to create or activate what we like to call energy carriers. And these are going to be things like ATP and NADPH. Now, ATP we're familiar with. That's the chemical form of energy, courtesy of the mitochondria. NADPH is what we like to call a high energy electron carrier. High energy electron carrier. And what's going to happen is we're breaking down the bonds of the chemical energy courtesy of the sunlight. And as we're breaking the bonds, we're releasing the electrons. And these electrons are going to be carried in NADPH molecules. And we're going to discuss this in great detail, I promise, in chapter 14. But for now, when you see NADPH mentioned, I want you to think it's carrying electrons, which means it's carrying a form of energy. And ATP obviously is our chemical energy. Also notice how at the end of stage 1, our light-dependent reaction, we're going to have the release of oxygen molecules. That's the same oxygen that we inhale. Now, the reason I point this out is because for the plants, oxygen is considered a waste product. It doesn't need it. It's a byproduct of the reaction of the water molecules working together with the electromagnetic energy of the sun. So plants will release that oxygen into the atmosphere, and then we utilize it for our respiration, but also we use it for aerobic respiration, the whole process of converting energy into ATP molecules. The second step of photosynthesis is called many different things. It can be called carbon fixation. Some people like to call it the Calvin cycle. Some people like to call it the light independent cycle. Either way, what we see happening is in the second stage of photosynthesis, we get to the final product, which is the production of sugar or glucose molecule. So this is the food that the plant is producing for itself. And in order to be completely successful, it does require an input of carbon dioxide. So that's why they like to call it a carbon fixation step. Carbon dioxide is derived mostly from the atmosphere. Now, we as humans are a huge contributor to carbon dioxide release because for us, it's actually considered a waste product. Every time we exhale, we release that carbon dioxide into the atmospheres. And then it's often utilized, for instance, by plants so that they can complete their photosynthesis. Hopefully you can see that by the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, it makes sense why humans benefit from plants and vice versa, because we each are providing the gas that the other needs to complete their process and get rid of our waste products. Now, once we have our food, or for the plants, for instance, once they have completed photosynthesis, then what we see happening is very similar to with us as our heterotrophs. Once we sit down and we consume our food, and we're breaking the chemical bonds, and we're releasing the energy within the chemical bonds, we see that we have to go ahead and convert that energy into another form. And that is then where a process called cellular respiration comes into play, because cellular respiration is going to allow us to convert that energy and produce ATP molecules, which is going to be our main mechanism of being able to utilize chemical energy in a cell-to-cell basis. Now over here, we're going to see that in our diagram, they focus it on photosynthesis on the left-hand side, and they're showing you how photosynthesis, as discussed previously, will generate the waste product of oxygen, and it will require carbon dioxide for it to be completed, right? For us to produce the sugars that we rely on. Now, once you have the food, remember the food goes into a food web. So you have a heterotroph that comes and starts chewing on the plant, or even us, if you had a piece of lettuce on that chicken sandwich we were eating before, or maybe you had a nice salad. What we're doing is we're going to transfer that energy from the food from the autotroph and introduce it into our system. And when we introduce our foods, what we see happening is that our body has to convert that energy into ATP. And to do so, it's going to go ahead and do aerobic respiration. Now, there are many different forms of respiration. You have anaerobic, you have fermentation, but by far the most effective is going to be aerobic respiration. That's what humans do primarily. Aerobic respiration means that I take my glucose molecule, my sugar molecule, and along the way I utilize oxygen to make sure that I'm effectively removing the energy from the sugar molecules, and I'm transferring it into as many ATP molecules as I possibly can. And as you can guess, because we're making ATP molecules, we are utilizing the mitochondria for cellular respiration. In order for cellular respiration to be as effective as possible, we see that the oxygen molecule will become our final electron carrier. And as an end result of doing cellular respiration, our body will generate carbon dioxide as a waste product. So we're going to release that carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is going to go right back into the system through the use of photosynthesis so that autotrophs can generate more food on their end. All right, so here's a little diagram of how carbon atoms are continuously cycled through the biosphere. I literally just read the title of the figure. Sorry about that. So here you can see that in red is indicating the release of the carbon, CO2, and then in green it's the usage of it. And what we can see happening is that within our food chain, we can see that plants require, or any photosynthetic organisms, require carbon dioxide to complete photosynthesis. Animals, when they do their cellular respiration, so the conversion of food molecules into ATP, they release carbon dioxide. Now, plants also do cellular respiration, obviously. We just saw that on the previous page, right? When the plant has its glucose molecule, it also has to convert the glucose molecule into ATP, because that's the form of energy that the cells can communicate with and can utilize. So the plant will actually release carbon dioxide as it's doing cellular respiration, just like we do our conversion of making our ATP molecules. And even if you look towards the bottom of the chart, you're going to notice that when the plants and the animals and all organisms unfortunately meet their end of their life cycle and they start forming their sediments and the formation of fossil fuels, that carbon dioxide is still being trapped in there, and it's being, in essence, saved for another occasion. For instance, if you look at the bark of a tree, that is filled with carbon dioxide. And over time, we see that it's released again back into the atmosphere and back into the water so that it can once again be recycled and utilized for photosynthesis. One of the other things that I want to mention as we start to wrap up part 1 of chapter 3 is that at its core, you always need to complete chemical reactions in order to transfer energy from one source to the next. And what I mean with that is that, as we discussed in chapter 2, it's the electrons of a molecule that basically form the bond from one atom to the next. And when you start moving around your electrons and you start doing things like your covalent bond and your ionic bond, what you're doing is you're doing what we like to call an oxidation and a reduction reaction. And oxidation and reduction are going to refer to how we transfer the electrons from one molecule to the next, or from one state to the next. And what we're going to see happening is whenever you have an interaction between two separate atoms, one atom will always give away its electron and the other one will always be receiving more its electron. And it's not necessarily giving away like an ionic bond. It just means that even when you're sharing, one tends to share slightly more than the other. There never really is a true equal process, even when you're doing a nonpolar covalent bond. Because of the reaction, there always tends to be one that has slightly more electron interaction than the other. Now, oxidation is going to refer to the release or the loosing of an electron. Reduction is going to be about the gaining of the electron. So within a molecule, we're always going to see that one atom, when they interact, one of them will go through oxidation. And when they do oxidation, that means that they release the electron. And when they release the electron, the overall weight of that atom becomes slightly lighter because it's losing a component of itself, and therefore it also becomes more positive. So it's indicated by a positive signal, and oxidized is the term that we utilize to indicate that the electron has been lost. It has been moved to another atom. The atom that receives the electron is going to be reduced. And when it's reduced, it's going to become more negative, because remember, electrons carry a negative charge. And it's also going to be slightly heavier because it has another component that it relies on. And that is then why the reduction term comes into play. This is very important to point out, because remember, at the core, what we're doing is we're transferring energy from one form to the next. And we can take a look at it in a large scale, meaning something like a food web. How does food move from an autotroph to a heterotrope to a heterotrope to a decomposer all the way back? But we can also zoom in and take a look at how our electrons are behaving. And when we do that, that is then when we're going to use the term oxidation and reduction. Now, before I end this, and we're going to talk more about oxidation and reduction. We're going to talk more about this when we do chapter 13, because we definitely have to keep mentioning the fact, or we still have to discuss the fact, that enzymes play a very important role in the transfer of energy, because they're going to allow us to reduce our activation energy so we can do these processes at a faster pace. We're also going to talk about the fact that a lot of times our body, as it's breaking down components and it's transferring energy from one form to the next, it likes to do it in a step-by-step process. And when it does it in a step-by-step process, it's able to control the release of energy at a higher degree so that we can release small bouts of energy and thereby control the amount of heat that's generated. So for instance, when we were talking about cellular respiration, the process of converting glucose into ATP molecules, and I said to you, we do aerobic respiration, we use oxygen. That process involves 3 steps. You have to do glycolysis, you have to do your Krebs cycle, you have to do an electron transport chain, and with each step you release small bits of ATP molecules. If the cell were to do everything in one step, so just take that glucose molecule, rip it apart, release the energy and make ATP, it would generate so much heat that the cell would literally lyse open and pop open. And of course that would be detrimental to the cell, which means we don't get a benefit out of its energy transfer. One other thing I want to mention is that keep in mind that we've actually been talking about energy in several chapters already. We've just been using different terms to describe it. So for instance, when we were talking about dehydration versus hydrolysis, we were talking about building versus destroying. And now we can go ahead and we can add terms like catabolic and anabolic, oxidation and reduction. All of these terms are opposites from each other, right? So dehydration is when I was building my polymers and I was releasing water as a waste product. Hydrolysis is when I use water to pull my macromolecules apart, right? Same thing with catabolic is when I'm destroying. Anabolic is when I'm building it back up. We're going to give it a different name in this case because we're concentrating more on how energy is being utilized. If I now say oxidation and reduction, we're describing the fact that one is giving away its electrons. So when you oxidize, you're in essence are doing a mini hydrolysis. You're getting smaller. On the other hand, reduction is when you're gaining the electron. So now you're doing a little dehydration, but we're giving it a different name because oxidation and reduction are going to involve electrons, whereas dehydration and hydrolysis take a look at larger molecules, and catabolic and anabolic takes a look at exactly which one releases energy and which one requires energy. So all these terms start to correlate with each other, and collectively they keep describing how energy can transfer from one form over to the next. Alrighty, so I'm going to stop talking for part 1. I think you have a lot to think about when it comes to the use of energy. And then whenever you're ready, go ahead and move on to part 2, where we're going to take a look at free energy and catalysis. All right, please remember I'm always available through email, and obviously I also encourage you to use your discussion sessions. We'll talk soon.